Welcome to Smart Talk. On this program, we hold discussions with leading economists and social scientists from around the world. There are no rules about what topics are brought to the table. The outcome is always interesting. Joining us today via Skype from Nashville is Richard Duncan. He is the author of several books, including The New Depression, which explains why the global recession is in danger of becoming another Great Depression. I'm Andrew Mazzone, president of the Henry George School of Social Science, and this is Smart Talk. How are you, Richard? Nice to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to let everybody know that we're such big fans of Richard Duncan that we use his material extensively in our coursework now. And the reason being, you could read 200 books on what has gone on in the last 30 or 40 years. And if you want the most concise, accurate description of what went on, you just read Richard's books, especially the New Depression book. But my question to Richard is going to be this. Before we describe a cursory outline of what happened from 45 to the present, I wanted to ask your opinion if you think this was all serendipity or there was planning to accomplish all the things that occurred. For example, the credit creation and all of that. In other words, was there a geopolitical method to all this madness, or was this simply happenstance that credit became the new paradigm overrunning the real economy?
Okay, well, I think it's a very long story, and that it really did just evolve due to unfolding events. I really think that you can trace everything that's happened in this latest crisis all the way back to World War I. In World War I, all the European countries went to war with each other, and they didn't have enough gold to fight the war. So they went off the classical gold standard, they stopped backing their currencies with gold, and they started issuing a lot of paper money to finance the government bonds that they sold to buy war materials. So that was the collapse of the classical gold standard in the First World War 100 years ago. And that set off a worldwide economic credit bubble that we call the Roaring Twenties. As all of the paper money that was created in World War I and all of the government debt that was issued to finance the war, that created a great boom during the 20s. And they say that was fun, but in 1930, all of that credit couldn't be repaid. And at that point, then the international banking system collapsed and global trade collapsed and the world went into the Great Depression. And it stayed in a depression for 10 years because the policymakers really had no idea what to do. They didn't really do very much about it. And they allowed market forces to reestablish a new market-determined equilibrium in the economy. And that's what happened without very much government intervention. But that equilibrium was at a level of GDP in the United States that was 46% below what it had been in 1929, and at a level of unemployment that ranged from 15 to 25% all during that decade. And during that decade, then the Germans took over Europe, and the Japanese took over Asia, and finally World War II started. And when World War II started, then out of necessity, US government spending increased by 900% just right off the bat. And that huge expansion of government spending into the Depression. But of course, the war then killed 50 or 60 million people. So it was really the necessity of World War II when the government took over absolute complete control over the US economy. They took over all of the production, all of the distribution. They controlled all the prices, and of course they controlled labor, right down to sending people to war, to die. And so there was a complete government takeover of the economy in World War II, and things never went back to anything really resembling capitalism after that. After the war did end, instead of government spending being cut very substantially, what we've seen is that government spending has gone up really steadily, if not radically, if not exponentially, since World War II, starting with the Korean War and then the Vietnam War. So really the government has been managing the economy, in my opinion, really going back at least to World War II. And okay, that was not something that they chose to do, really. It was something that they had to do in order to survive the Nazis and the Japanese. And afterwards, they continued to do that and were ultimately able to defeat the Soviet Union that way. But in order to do that, they've had to really take complete control over the economy to a very considerable extent. And during that process, in 1968, they got to the point where they had to stop backing US dollars with gold because the US didn't have enough gold reserves left anymore. So they broke the link between dollars and gold in 1968, and afterwards we had an absolute explosion of credit. Total credit expanded from $1 trillion in 1964 to now $59 trillion. And it's been that explosion of credit that's been driving economic growth in the last many decades.
Yeah, Richard, well, my question, of course, would be why wouldn't the government have tried to go back to a real economy, management of the economy, rather than pumping enormous amounts of credit into the system? After all, we won the war, where we've got a huge industrial capacity, real, with 25% of the output of the world. Why would we have had to resort to extensive credit creation at that point in time? It's understandable during the Depression and during the war, the financing, but why continue that?
Well, they were terrified that after the war ended, that the economy would go back into the Great Depression again if the government stopped spending. So at that point, by the time the war ended, the government debt relative to GDP was really quite high, above 100%. And so what they seem to have done is they allowed the government debt to gradually diminish relative to GDP. But in order to drive the economy, they began to encourage more credit being given to consumers. So consumer credit then began to grow very significantly. And not too much longer after that, then Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac became aggressive in their lending programs, and they issued a lot of debt and bought up a lot of mortgages, and that fueled economic growth in the U.S., especially, say, in the 90s and up until 2007. So one way or the other, they felt that it was necessary to keep the economy growing by expanding debt. Now, part of this, I think, was government policy, and part of it was just the way the market evolved when certain constraints were lifted. Some of it was market evolution, and some of it was government policy.
I see. But the fact is that we had a strong real economy at least until the 80s and 90s, but we allowed, in effect, outsourcing or giving up of our industries during that period, and that would have made it harder to for consumers or workers to pay any of the debts that were being incurred as part of the credit expansion in the U.S. economy. Why did the government encourage that, or not stop that, or look askance at that and not interfere?
So it's interesting, in the 1960s, during President Johnson administration, the U.S. government was spending a lot of money both overseas on the Vietnam War and domestically through the Great Society programs. And that led to budget deficits, and all of the spending overstimulated the U.S. economy. And that led to the high rates of inflation during the early 70s and up until throughout the 70s. So at that time, we were still on the Bretton Woods system up until 1971. And under that system, trade between countries more or less had to balance. There were automatic adjustment mechanisms that ensured that trade between countries balanced. And so when the US government spent too much money, it overstimulated the US economy, and we quickly got to domestic bottlenecks to the point where we had full industrial capacity and full employment. And so we had wage push inflation, and that led to wage spirals and inflation and double-digit inflation throughout the 70s, which Paul Volcker eventually crushed with very high interest rates. But then President Reagan was elected And he came in and had even bigger budget deficits than Lyndon Johnson had had. And once again, that caused the US economy to boom. But what changed starting in 1980 is that the United States started tolerating trade deficits. It allowed itself to have trade deficits with other countries. And soon those deficits became very large. So all of the government spending stimulated the US economy, but it didn't lead to high rates of inflation because suddenly we didn't have just a domestic economy anymore. We had a global economy. The trade deficit hit 3.5% of US GDP in the mid-80s. And by 2007, it had grown to 6% of GDP, which was $800 billion in 2006. It was $2 million a minute that the US was going into debt to the rest of the world because of the US trade deficit. So the government was able to stimulate the economy through large budget deficits and through pumping credit into the housing market through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And that pushed up home prices during the 90s and the early part of the 2000s. And the higher home prices allowed the Americans to extract equity from their homes and continue spending more and having a better standard of living in general, even though their wages were flat to declining because globalization was resulting in a deindustrialization of the country. So all the jobs went offshore, but for quite a long time, the standard of living continued to improve, or at least not deteriorate, because Fannie and Freddie were pushing up the home prices and allowing people to take equity out of their homes. And in that way, the economy continued to grow. And as the US economy grew, the global economy grew. But everything stopped in 2008 when we got to the point where the American households had so much debt that they couldn't repay it and started defaulting. And we had a systemic collapse of the financial sector. And it was only then that we would have collapsed back into a new depression again had the government not intervened with trillion-dollar budget deficits every year for several years in a row, financed in large part by paper money creation by the Fed, quantitative easing on a trillion-dollar scale.
How does this help the American people in the long run when their job prospects are diminished because of the offshoring and, China builds up a massive manufacturing capability and they're doing it with essentially an undervalued currency and just buying American debt, which whether they ever cash in or not would make no difference to them. They'll have the industrial apparatus. What do the Americans do in the long run in the face of this kind of strategy or outcome?
So I think the policy response they put in place after things blew up has been successful in really keeping what was a global bubble. They've managed to keep it inflated. Now, as far as your question about the long run, well, I don't really think there's a lot of focus on the long run when it comes to government policy at this point. I think the philosophy that's guiding policy now and since 2008 is their belief that it's better to die tomorrow than die today. Mm-hmm. And so they have managed to keep the bubble inflated, and they're probably going to continue to try to keep it inflated for as long as they possibly can, and just hope for the best.
But there's a limit to this. I mean, you yourself would know that it's an impossibility, or else that means we can get something for nothing forever. So somewhere at the end of this rainbow, there's going to be a day of reckoning for somebody. Your opinion, who would it be that's going to pay the price here?
Yes, I mean, I think that the way things are going, that this, as you say, this can't go on forever. But I do think it could go on for quite a number of years still. I mean, consider Japan. Japan's bubble popped 25 years ago, and they have managed to stay out of depression in large part because every year the Japanese government has had a very large budget deficit. And they've taken Japan's government debt from 60% of Japan's GDP up to 250% of GDP. And they've managed to do this without causing inflation, because when you have a bubble and it pops, it tends toward deflation rather than inflation. And they've been able to finance these very large budget deficits with low interest rates. The yield on the 10-year Japanese government bond is only 50 basis points now. So since the US crisis started in 2008, the government debt has gone up very significantly, but even still, it's only something like 100% of GDP, or just a little bit over 100% of GDP. So the U.S. economy is about $17 trillion in size, a little bit more than that. So what that suggests is that the U.S. government could borrow and spend another $17 trillion that it doesn't have through budget deficits before it even hit 200% government debt to GDP.
Let me just say this, but the Japanese have always been net exporters during this period, so they always have had money to pay the interest on any kind of debt they would incur. We do not have the net exports in our favor. We're negative exporters in effect. So they can tolerate more than we can. They've got a means to pay for it. We have to pay for our deficits with more credit. So it might be a little different for us than them. One thing, and the next thing is, if they issue credit, if we're hollowing out our own manufacturing, where would the credit land to be productive in this country? Since major industries are gone, the real estate bubble, I mean, there's enough real estate right now to cover the country for the next few years. Where would we spend this extra credit? How would it filter in and realize itself in the real American economy as it's now structured?
Yeah, very good points. On your first point about Japan, you're right. They do have certain advantages that the U.S. doesn't have, their trade surplus. But on the other hand, the U.S. has advantages that Japan doesn't have. The U.S. has the dollar standard. And so when we have a big trade deficit, as we always do, this year it's, I think, something like $450 billion, every country's balance of payments has to balance. So when the U.S. has a trade deficit of $450 billion, it will have capital inflows of $450 billion to completely offset that trade deficit. So the way that works in practice is the trade deficit, U.S. trade deficit, results in dollars being thrown off into the global economy and into the trade surplus countries like China. So the Chinese manufacturers sell their goods in the U.S., they get paid in dollars, they take the dollars back to China, and they'd like to convert these dollars into the local currency, the Chinese yuan. But if they did that in a free market, converted so many dollars, China's trade surplus with the U.S. is about $340 billion last year. Converting so many dollars into yuan would cause the yuan to skyrocket, appreciate so sharply that would kill China's export-led growth and kill their economy. So to prevent the currency there from appreciating, the Chinese central bank prints the equivalent of $340 billion worth of their own currency from thin air, just the way the Fed does through quantitative easing. But when they print their currency, they use it to buy the dollars coming into China at a fixed exchange rate. So the central bank ends up accumulating last year an extra $340 billion roughly, which they then need to reinvest in US dollar assets if they're going to earn any interest on them. So the bigger the trade deficit is, the more money that flows back into the US. And this reinvestment of the holdings of US dollars by the trade surplus central banks ends up financing the budget deficit. So that's an advantage the US has that Japan didn't have. And so far, so good. I mean, we've managed to finance something like $6 trillion of deficits over the last, since 2008, and we have extremely low interest rates. And that seems like that's going to continue into the foreseeable future. We don't have any inflation because globalization is so deflationary. Now, if free trade broke down, or if we had some sort of international conflict with China, and we put up trade barriers against Chinese goods, then suddenly we would have high rates of inflation in the US, and that would make all of this paper money creation impossible. Normally, when a central bank creates a lot of money, it leads to very high rates of inflation. But that hasn't happened because globalization is putting so much downward pressure on global wages, US wages, that it's very deflationary. You don't have to hire someone in Michigan and pay that person $200 a day to build a car anymore. You can hire someone in China and pay that person $10 a day. So this is very deflationary, and it's offsetting all of the pressure, the inflationary pressure from the paper money creation, and it's created it's it's created what I believe is a unique moment in history where what we've seen over the last 6 years is it is possible for the US government to spend trillions of dollars it doesn't have and to finance much of that by printing paper money without causing high rates of inflation. So now coming to the second part of your question about where is this new credit going to go, I think to make this sustainable, the sensible approach would be rather than the US government borrowing and spending a lot of money on too much consumption and on a lot of unnecessary wars around the world, it would be much more sensible for the US government to borrow money and spend it, but spend it by investing it in new industries and new technologies that would probably allow the US economy to grow its way out of this crisis. I'd like to see them invest, over the next 10 years, I'd like to see the government invest $1 trillion in solar energy, $1 trillion in genetic engineering, $1 trillion in biotech, $1 trillion in nanotech, and a few other industries. And that sort of borrowing and spending, it would be like a series of NASA space program investments. And you can just imagine all of the benefits that would pour out of that in terms of new technologies, new innovation, job creation, education expansion.
Why wouldn't that money basically go to China, Germany, and Japan and Asia to build all that solid product, since they have the capacity now and we don't? So what makes you think that although the idea makes sense, if American industrial capacity essentially was intact, essentially it's not intact, and essentially that within only 10% of the population is engaged seriously in manufacturing, and everything else is a service, medical or educational processing type industry. And the industries you're talking about are hard investment industries. That product would immediately draw in the world manufacturing capability, which does not exist here.
Well, of course, spending on the sort of scale that we're talking about would have to be planned over a 10-year period. And so part of the money could be invested in universities and training PhDs and advanced degrees so that the Americans could transition into much higher skill set. And then, for instance, the money I'd like to see invested in solar energy, much of that would have to involve laying the solar panels across the United States and then building a grid coast to coast to transmit the electricity through. The current grid doesn't work for solar.
Again, I mean, those industries, the solar panels could be easily made in Asia. The genetic engineering would fill the universities, it's true, but you're talking about the elite part of the American workforce. The bulk of the American people may not necessarily gain from that program, given that it's multinationals who will get all the contracts, and they'll decide where and how they'll invest the money. But over and above that, what if the Chinese finally get big enough, they think, and they're forming investment banks themselves, and they simply use the credit that they have with us to create massive credit on their side, and finally hook up, let's say, with India and Russia, and they become a reserve currency country? Then what does the United States do when it doesn't have a monopoly on credit creation at that point? In effect, they're short-circuited right out of the process that you've talked about.
Well, just one final word on the investment programs I described. Now, that's what I think ideally should be done, but in reality, there's almost no chance of that occurring. So I think that would be a sensible approach, but I have very little hope that anything like that will occur. Now, in terms of China taking over as the country of reserve currency, well, first of all, China's economy is in extreme trouble now. China probably has the biggest economic bubble in the world, and they're going to find it very difficult just to hold things together, I think. But in order to have a reserve currency, you need to get your currency out in the global economy. And to do that, you need to have trade deficits. The US dollar is the reserve currency because we have such massive deficits. Everyone's flooded with dollars. And so people have a lot of dollars to spend, so they spend dollars, and dollars is a global reserve currency. China has a massive global trade surplus. And so if they want their currency to be a reserve currency, first of all, they're going to have to make a little bit more of it available by having a trade deficit, which their economy is not geared to at all. So I don't think there's any chance of China replacing the dollar as the international reserve currency anytime soon.
Well, at this point in time then, if we're locked into being the reserve currency, we certainly have the military power on the globe to maintain stability, and we certainly are the financial power. All of this doesn't take a lot of people, American people, to do this. Maybe 10% of the population can run this system. What happens to the balance of Americans, especially if we don't have the massive programs you've talked about? Their prospects for an increasing standard of living are not good at all, as far as I can see. Right or wrong?
Right. Yes, the outlook for the American public is very alarming because globalization has resulted in all of the manufacturing jobs being moved offshore. And that has resulted in the unions being more or less decimated. And so the potential, the ability for the working class and the middle class to organize itself to ensure that there are politicians and policies put in place in Washington that benefit the middle class and the working class, those are no longer available because there's no real way for the middle class and the working class to organize itself as it did when there were strong labor unions in the country. So that's why we've seen the shrinking middle class, and the median income in the U.S. is still the same. It's roughly the same level now as it was in 1989.
And automation feeds into this. In addition, automation compounds.
That's right. Automation potentially is going to also make far fewer people required on the assembly lines. So we'll have to see what happens. I mean, ultimately, if the working people continue to see their standard of living go down, then they may eventually organize themselves and form a third party and put more pressure on the establishment to put in place policies that would be more beneficial to them.
The question is, how would you distribute that taxation power of, let's say, large profits created by credit? How would you distribute it to the population without making it an obvious welfare system? Or this is one of those things that we have to wait and see how it evolves? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to wait and see how it evolves. Right now, there's very little indication that that is going to occur. I mean, things are not entirely dire. Over the last 6 years, at least what we've seen with Obamacare, now 20 or 30 million more Americans have health insurance than before. That's a step forward. And also the government is providing, I think over the last 6 years, the government has provided something like $600 billion of student loans that is making it possible for more students to go to university. Now, we'll see whether they'll be able to repay that. Maybe one day a lot of that money will just simply be written off. And so it's not all doom and gloom in terms of the outlook for the Americans. I live in Asia. I've lived in Asia most of the last 25 years, and the standard of living in the United States is certainly still far ahead of most of the rest of the world. So the Americans are not suffering too terribly at this stage, but the outlook for them is not very encouraging.
Where would you invest? What would you be doing to protect your future or your children's future, given how you see everything and that you pretty well are the master of seeing it all here?
One good investment is to invest in land and houses. In other words, buy a house on a half an acre of land using a 15-year fixed mortgage, lock it in at near historic low rates of interest over a 15-year period, and rent it out, and the place will nearly pay for itself over 15 years from the rental income. And afterwards, you will have a valuable asset that will generate cash flow for you forever afterwards.
Land in Asia, land in America.
Land in the United States or Canada, just because you have more control over it. In many countries, for instance, I live in Thailand. Foreign people are not allowed to buy land in Thailand.
Richard, thanks for the interview. It was very informative. Your works are fabulous. Everyone should read The New Great Depression.
And sign up for my blog, and you can follow my work that way at richardduncaneconomics.com.
Thank you, Richard. Take care.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. In upcoming shows, we will be talking to such renowned economists as Dr. James Galbraith. Dr. Galbraith is a professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. His most recent book is Inequality and Instability, a study of the world economy just before the Great Crisis. Please post your questions or comments on our website at henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzone. We will see you again next time.